Good afternoon and welcome to the pre-blizzard adult issues class. So those of you watching online that may not know me, I'm Tim Mosher. I'm a physician, and for the last 40 years I've been involved in healthcare and medical research. And today I'll be discussing the growing anti-science movement in America. Because of my background, I'll be focusing more on the anti-vaccine movement, but just to be clear, I'm not going to be talking about the specifics of vaccine safety or vaccine efficacy. I'm not going to be making recommendations about vaccine. My goal really is to ask the question, how did we get here? For decades, America was the #1 country in science and technology. How did we become the #1 country in the anti-science movement? As I was preparing for this talk, I spent a lot of time walking through the forest of Pisgah State Park. It's where I do my thinking. It's the largest state park in southwest corner of New Hampshire. It's a place of incredible beauty and serenity. There's these mountain streams, there's beaver ponds, there's beautiful overlooks of surrounding mountains. This is Mount Monadnock in southern New Hampshire. And as you're walking through Pisgah, you'll also see signs that this was once the home of colonial settlers from the late 1700s and 1800s. You'll see those classic New England stacked stone walls coursing through the woods, the edges of former pastures and roads. You'll see the remains of old homesteads and schools and places of business. And as you're exploring, you'll also see these family burial grounds scattered throughout the park. And as you start exploring, you start to see this interesting pattern emerge where you have these large stones surrounded by multiple small stones. A lot of them are unmarked, some of them they have only initials on them. And these are the graves of children. And there's a lot of these stones scattered around these graveyards. If you were a child born in the early 1800s, you had about a 50-50 chance of living to see your 5th birthday. Most of these children died from infectious disease. I always think it was probably really difficult to be a physician back in the 1800s. You didn't have a lot to work with. You didn't have any medicines, you didn't have antibiotics, you didn't have ventilators or pediatric ICUs, all those resources we have in modern medicine. You spent a lot of time sitting at the bedside of very sick and dying children. They weren't there just giving comfort. Fortunately, they were observing. They were seeing patterns. They were making hypotheses. They were collecting data. They were developing treatments. They were doing research. And they were pretty good at it. This is the plot of U.S. child mortality from 1800 to present. And as I mentioned, in the early half of the 1800s, child mortality was close to 50%. But there were significant improvements in the second half of the 1800s. It was primarily due to a growing awareness of the importance of sanitation. There was a lot of investment in public health infrastructure, a real emphasis on water purity. There was a pasteurization of milk, which cut back on tuberculosis. There was improved nutrition. And those improvements continued into the 1900s. There was the development of new medications. There was a further development of vaccines. There was the introduction of antibiotics. I think sometimes forget that the first antibiotic became available in the early 1940s. That was penicillin. It's a relatively recent innovation. And those improvements continue to the present time, where currently child mortality rates are less than 1% in the United States. So we take for granted that our children are going to grow up to be adults, but for most of humanity, that was unusual. That didn't happen. For the last 150 years, science has really made tremendous progress in the human condition. It's been a bright light that's helped take us out of the dark ages. But it takes a lot of work, and if we take it for granted, it can easily go away. Unfortunately, these are really difficult times to be a scientist. Americans' view of science has become very politicized. You're seeing growing dissent and apathy against scientists. There's a lot of loss of trust. We're seeing anger and sometimes outright violence against science organizations. There's been a proliferation of scientific misinformation, not just on social media, but even in mainstream media. Former leaders of fringe anti-vaccine movements are now leading our healthcare. And we're seeing a trend where now science and recommendations about vaccine schedules and how science are no longer really tied to the best science. And it's not just at the federal level. A 2025 AP study found that there were more than 420 bills in state legislatures that were anti-science, that were weakening our protection against water safety, against milk safety. There was one bill in Minnesota that wanted to label mRNA technology as a weapon of mass destruction. This is technology that allows us to have cells make therapeutic proteins. It gives the opportunity for new therapies and diseases like cancer and autoimmune diseases and chronic diseases. It was basically the basis for the 2023 Nobel Prize in Physiology. It's important technology that we ought to be investing in. And in August of last year, RFK canceled nearly $500 million in mRNA vaccine trials and studies that were out there. And so our research infrastructure has been gutted. In the 2025 budget, there was a proposed 40% reduction in NIH funding. Now, fortunately, Congress and Senate are pushing back against these cuts in therapy. It's not clear whether they're going to make it through appropriation. But frankly, the damage has already been done. That uncertainty about the science has caused us to lose infrastructure. We've had to close clinical trials. Patients that were enrolled in those clinical trials have been lost to follow-up. We have a lot of scientists that are leaving the country and finding work elsewhere. This was a poll in last year's Nature where they said 75% of US scientists are considering leaving the field. Science has been the economic driver of our economy for many, many years. It's that innovation and technology is what we've been really good at. And frankly, if we lose it, it's very, very hard to get back. One of the problems is with scientific misinformation. Now, in America, we've always struggled a little bit between the balance of our First Amendment right to free speech and misinformation. It's particularly problematic when you're talking about healthcare-related misinformation, because misinformation there can have significant consequences on people's health. It's estimated that as many as 12 million Americans may have foregone COVID-19 vaccines because of misinformation. And the Johns Hopkins analysis estimated this resulted in 1,200 excess hospitalizations and 300 excess deaths per day. So it has serious consequences when that misinformation gets out there. Now, a recent National Academy of Medicine report in October of last year addressed the topic of misinformation with a report entitled Understanding and Addressing Misinformation About Science. This is a really in-depth review of the sources of misinformation, how it propagates, and recommendations on what we can do to help to kind of minimize the impact. And you can read it for free online on PDF, or if you're like me and rather have a book, you can order it online. It's about $35 or so. Pretty dense reading, but it gives you the whole background about misinformation. Now, I'm not going to talk a lot about misinformation. It was really a focus of the talk I gave last year on the attention economy. We're talking about why are we susceptible to misinformation? How does that information propagate so quickly? But I put a link on here if you want to go back and review that talk. There were some important definitions that I'm going to use that came out of that report. One is that Academy defines scientific misinformation as information that asserts or implies claims that are inconsistent with the weight of scientific evidence. And scientific disinformation is a subcategory of misinformation that is circulated by agents that are aware that the scientific information they are circulating is false. So that difference between misinformation and disinformation is really one of intent. So how do scientists respond when they're faced with misinformation? Well, this is Dr. Peter Hotez. He's a pediatric infectious disease specialist at Baylor College of Medicine. And he has spent much of his career kind of countering the misinformation about vaccines that are out there. He's a prolific author, he's on social media, he's a frequent guest on national shows talking about the need for vaccinations. And I respect what he does. It's very important work. It's also very dangerous work. If you want to read how dangerous it is, read his book. This guy gets frequent death threats. Now, as scientists, we like to think that the anti-science movement is rational. And if we present the studies to them and we can have a logical, analytical discussion about the topic, that's how science works. But I think what we have to remember is the anti-science movement doesn't operate in the realm of science. They operate in the realm of public opinion. And in public opinion, it's not about the science. Misinformation is a tactic, but it's not the goal. It's what they do, but it's not why they do it. And I think if we want to really counter the impacts of misinformation, we can't just try to listen to what they say. We have to understand why they're saying it. Now, the other reason I think addressing misinformation is not very effective is that most people don't understand what you're talking about. I mean, science has become so specialized and so complex that it's really outside the realm of most Americans. I mean, it's outside the realm of scientists working in other fields. We have scientists talking amongst themselves over here, and the general public is over there. And as scientists, part of it, we've lost the ability to explain our value and what we're doing to the general public. And so there's this big communication gap between the two. And we don't have a media that's capable of filling that void. And so most people's perspective of science isn't driven by an understanding of the underlying science, or it's not driven by a rational analysis. It's driven by intuition, gut instinct. How do I feel about the science? And unfortunately, that approach is really difficult to address with critical thinking and logic. It's also very susceptible to misinformation and basically misappropriation. So I think if we're going to look at how do we address the public around the topic of scientific misinformation, we're going to have to understand that emotive content. In the 17th century, Spinoza really understood this. He wrote, more than 4 centuries ago, reason cannot defeat an emotion. An emotion can only be displaced or overcome by a stronger emotion. And I think that's really applicable to this discussion. Now, there's really 3 themes, 3 features of the anti-science movement that I think you kind of look at when you're looking at the why. One is anti-rationalism. It's a rejection of reason with deference to emotion and intuition. I kind of made reference to that already. In the past, it was typically deference to one's religious beliefs. Currently, I think it's more often deference to one's political beliefs. The other theme is one of a populist anti-elitism. The rejection of experts as being elitist. And almost a kind of a resentment and anger against them. And finally is the need for practicality. That for most people, the role of science is to serve practical needs, solve basic problems. There's this general rejection of knowledge for knowledge's sake. And I think this is wrapped up well in Isaac Asimov's quote from 1980. There is a cult of ignorance in the United States, and there has always been. The strain of anti-intellectualism has been a constant thread winding its way through our political and cultural life, nurtured by the false notion that democracy means that my ignorance is just as good as your knowledge. I think it's pretty appropriate for now. So anti-science is tied to this broader theme of anti-intellectualism, which has really deep roots in American culture. You can argue that anti-intellectualism started way back in the 1600s with Enlightenment thinkers that felt that man's logic and ability to reason and using tools like science were the best way to advance the human condition. The counter-Enlightenment felt threatened by this. Felt that this kind of approach undermined the authority of the church, undermined the authority of the political aristocracy. And so for the last 400 years, there's been this ongoing tension between the progressive Enlightenment side movement and the conservative counter-Enlightenment side. And it's been a give and take that's been going back and forth in a cyclical fashion for centuries. Now, the American historian Richard Hofstadter, in his Pulitzer Prize winning 1964 book, it's one I would recommend reading. It's a great text. But what he talks about is that this anti-intellectualism is really embedded within American culture. He wrote it in response to McCarthy of the 1950s. And he said this anti-intellectual view that's coming on by McCarthy is nothing new. That if you look back through history, it happens again and again and again. And he really picked out 4 what he felt were drivers that were these themes that are running through American culture that helped explain that anti-intellectualism. One is Americans' demand for practicality rather than abstract theory. And you kind of think how this would happen in a country. You go, land in the United States. It's not like there was a lot of infrastructure here or safety nets. You had to deal with immediate problems just to survive the day. What was important now? You didn't have time to develop abstract theories about what you were going to do. I think as a result of this, there was a sense of being narrow and short-sighted. Your time scale became very short. Let's make it to tomorrow. Americans tended to self-select for those that were self-sufficient. If you picked up home in one country and moved to the United States, you probably had an element of self-sufficiency. And to survive here, you better be fairly self-sufficient. So kind of the outcome of that is we tend to be very libertarian. We tend to really be very focused on our own self-sufficiency and sometimes forget that we're part of a larger network, part of a larger community that may have different type of needs. There was a demand for common sense over intellect. If you lived out in the frontier, it's not like you could run down to the library and pick up a book on, how to plant corn, or pull down a YouTube video to be able to figure out how to fix your broken wagon wheel. There weren't many resources over there. You were basically reliant on yourself. You needed to have that ability to have self-sufficiency and learn from your experience. And that tended to kind of, also narrow people's perspective. Sometimes that leads to a lot of bias because you're kind of working through intuition. And finally, unlike Europe, which had a well-established intellectual class, the United States never really had much of an intellectual class. The closest it came was the Puritan and theologic thinkers of New England in the early colonial times. But for most of our history, we weren't somebody that had an established intellect. And so this pervasive of elitism when we hear about an intellectual class is another pervasive element within US culture. Now we tend to think of the anti-vaccine movement as something that's, it's front page news now, it's current, but it predated the formation of the United States. Smallpox was probably the most dreaded disease in colonial times. If smallpox came into a port city like Boston, it would typically affect 60% of the population, and 20% of them would probably die. Probably where it wiped out most of the Native American population. This epidemic of 1721 was the 6th epidemic that Boston had since their founding in the 1630s. So these epidemics were frequent. And you may be familiar with Cotton Mather, who was involved in the Salem witch trials. He was also a theologian, a writer, and a scientist. He was also a father, and he knew the impact of infectious disease. He had 14 children, 7 of them died in infancy, and only 1 lived to see age 30. And he was also very aware of smallpox, and he became familiar with what was happening in Africa, where they would take infected material from one individual and inoculate it in another person, and then when that person got infected with smallpox, it didn't have a serious response. He was also aware that there were other cultures that were doing this. It was used in Turkey, and so he was recommending doing that in Boston. In fact, he did on one of his own children. Well, at the same time, Dr. William Douglas, who was a formally trained physician over in Scotland and came over to Boston, thought this was crazy. This was dangerous, and they battled back and forth with these pamphlet wars on the pro and cons of inoculation. And sometimes it got very personal. It's kind of like a Facebook discussion we had back in the 1700s. But ultimately, the pandemic went away, but there were 800 dead Bostonians afterwards. What was interesting, of the 280 plus people that got inoculated, only 6 of them died. But despite this relative success of inoculation, most of the citizens in Boston were very skeptical about this practice. And even 55 years later, when Washington wanted to inoculate his troops, he met a lot of resistance. Now, for most of the 1800s, there was a strong anti-intellectual movement going on, but it was primarily in politics and education and religion. It really wasn't pushing back much against science. At that time, most people viewed science as being very practical. Look, you just improved our health care, you got us indoor plumbing, there's good transportation, we can now communicate through the telegraph, there's all this industrial advancement that's going on. It was solving real problems. And most of it wasn't coming from an intellectual class, it was coming from businessmen. They were developing new industries that were driving the economy. Now, the one area of science that did get a little pushback was evolution. And you kind of understand that. It's kind of a direct affront to a literal interpretation of the Bible that was common in the fundamental church at the time. And that came to a head in the Scopes trial of 1925. Scopes was a high school science teacher in Tennessee, and he was accused of violating the Butler Act, which is an act that said you can't teach evolution within public schools. And it pitted Clarence Darrow against the great orator William Jennings Bryan. But on a larger level, it was also a battle of the religious modernists that felt that evolution was compatible with religious teaching versus the literal interpretation from the religious fundamentalists. and even on a more philosophical level, really pitted the idea of the Enlightenment thinkers that knowledge is gained through rational thought versus the counter-Enlightenment, which said, no, knowledge is gained through faith and revelation. Now, both the Enlightenment and counter-Enlightenment thinkers throughout time have misused science. But it's interesting, they do it in different ways. If you look at the counter-Enlightenment, the approach is typically one of scientific denialism. You saw that kind of the denial of evolution. If we look at current time, an example of it would be the denial of climate change. It's kind of an example of that. On the Enlightenment side, it's more often scientific misappropriation, taking a bit of science and extrapolating out to the extreme, where it's not really appropriate. An example of that would, the discussions around the health hazards from genetically modified foods. That's kind of overstated. But back in the 1800s, kind of the use of scientific misappropriation came with theory of eugenics, which was established in 1883 by Charles Darwin's half-brother, Sir Francis Galton. This was the belief that the human species could be advanced by selective breeding. And this really took off in the United States, initially primarily within the progressive movement that was popular at the time, but then also within conservatives. So the United States was the international hotbed for eugenics. And at the Second International Congress of Eugenics, the president at that time in his presidential address, the president, Dr. Henry Osborne, had this to say: as science has enlightened government in the prevention and spread of disease, it must also enlighten government in the spread and multiplication of worthless members of society. Don't think that would go over big in a presidential address now. Now, as I mentioned, US was like the big spot for eugenics. In fact, it was so big that it's what the Germans used to establish their 1935 race laws. So we had a part to play in that. I would say it was also part of mainstream scientific thinking at the time. This was a 1934 New England Journal of Medicine editorial bemoaning the fact that the US just wasn't advanced enough, their society was advanced enough to understand eugenics, that only Germany was the society that was far enough along to really understand this. And they wrote this in their editorial: until public sentiment can be molded to look at the matter in a scientific experiment, it will be necessary to employ moral suasion in getting the largest possible number of assents to advise for the application of this treatment. The treatment being forced sterilization. Now, in the late 1930s, at that point, there was about 30 states in the US that had laws regarding forced sterilization of certain classes of people. Pennsylvania wasn't one of them. And it went to the Supreme Court in 1927 in the Buck versus Bell, which was decided 8-1, upholding the role of forced sterilization. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. wrote in the court, "It is better for the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough." I think it's kind of interesting that they use the concept of compulsory vaccination as justification for forced sterilization. Now, throughout time, there's also been thinkers that have pushed back, had a resistance to modernity. So that's another theme that runs through American culture. And I would say that's a really important theme that you need to listen to. 2 of my favorite authors are Henry David Thoreau and Wendell Berry, and they both wrote on this topic. And Walden, Thoreau talks a lot about the impact of the Industrial Revolution on the individual person. In fact, it takes away personal autonomy and personal self-sufficiency. He also had this to write about technology specifically. He said, "We are in a great haste to construct a magnetic telegraph from Maine to Texas. But Maine and Texas, it may be, have nothing important to communicate." And in the 1977 book, The Unsettling of America, if you're going to read Wendell Berry, this is a classic one to read. But it talks about the impact on the individual family farmer in the setting of this large, growing industrial agriculture. He said he ought to be anxious because he is helpless, that he is dependent upon so many specialists. The beneficiary of so much expert help can only mean that he is a captive, a potential victim. And I think these are important questions to ask. Are we controlling science and technology, or is the science and technology controlling us? And that's not anti-science. That's important ways to make sure that science is adding value to our society. Now, we often think that anti-science is just a grassroots phenomenon that pops up. But in reality, it oftentimes is highly organized. It's intentional in its purpose to achieve specific economic and political gains. If you want to learn a little bit more about the business of the anti-science movement, I recommend this book, Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Oreskes and Eric Conway. This book highlights the role of 4 very prominent physicists who in the mid and late 1900s played an exceptional role in establishing the modern anti-science movement. And these were exceptional physicists. I mean, several worked on the Manhattan Project. Several were in the National Academy of Science, which is like the Hall of Fame for scientists. In fact, Fred Seitz was the president of the National Academy of Science. They were the deans of colleges. They founded new institutes. They were heavily networked within their fields. They were on advisory boards for industry, for government. They were the elite of that time. And yet they worked in a collaborative fashion to systemically spread misinformation and confusion about the hazards for a variety of topics. The hazards of smoking, acid rain, fluorocarbons, and ozone depletion, and human-caused climate change. Oftentimes they were funded either directly by industry or by conservative groups, and their primary goal was to oppose government regulation of these industries. That was really their objective that they were trying to attain with this. And similarly, the anti-vaccine movement is really driven by a relatively small number of people. And a 2021 study found that 12 individuals were responsible for 2/3 of the anti-vaccine content on social media platforms. Some of these people had medical backgrounds, most didn't. A lot of them had business interests in the anti-vaccine movement, either on the attention economy or they were selling food supplements, other alternative health information that they were gaining profits from. Now, in the 1960s, the tobacco industry recognized that they were in trouble. There was this growing body of data out there demonstrating association of smoking with lung cancer and other respiratory conditions. And so what to do about this? This is probably going to have a negative impact on future sales and is likely to get the government starting to impose regulations. So they worked with Dr. Seitz to really come up with a strategy on how to approach this. Dr. Seitz, with his background in science and being so connected within government, worked out a strategy for it. Really kind of is the anti-science playbook that was so effective, it is still in use today. And so there's a couple key themes to that. The first is you have to sow doubt. When there's this scientific consensus that's out there, the first thing you have to do is make people believe that there's no consensus, that question hasn't been answered yet. So for 30 years, they were able to move along that smoking and lung cancer weren't correlated, that there were these other causes. We just needed to look more because we shouldn't act too prematurely on regulating this industry. A current topic now would be climate change. Whereas if you were out and you sampled climatologists, there'd be about 97, 98% agreement that human-caused climate change is real. But if you go out and sample the public, that number is much lower. They're getting this information that this question still hasn't been answered. The next is to spread disinformation. And the way to do this is you select information you presented out of context. I think a good example of that is the discussion we've had about acetaminophen during pregnancy as a cause of autism. There were some early observational studies early on in that said there might be an association. But there's been a vast amount of research that's been done since then that have not been able to find any statistical link. But you don't hear that part of the argument. Next is leverage the fair doctrine policy. The fair doctrine policy was a policy that went into place when you had media conglomerates. And it was a way to ensure that both sides of the argument got equal airtime. But it's also really helpful if you want to get your information in front of the public. Because he said, you talked about that side of the argument, you've got to get me on your station. And it's a way of communicating directly to the public. And you don't have to worry about the problems of peer review and that. You could put borderline true information or misinformation in front of the public And if people call you on it, plausible deniability. I'm just asking questions here. It's for the good of science that we just ought to be thinking more broadly. And finally, you attack the individual scientists, particularly the scientists that are challenging the information that you're putting out there. And you see a lot of that now. Investigators that are working on vaccines are supposedly in the back pockets of the pharmaceutical industry, and there's this big cabal out there that's spreading misinformation. It's really trying to attempt to undermine the credibility of the scientists that are doing this work. And the goal here is really to control public policy by controlling public opinion. So as I was reading this book, the thing that struck me is, why? Why would these scientists with such incredible careers throw away that legacy to spread scientific misinformation? And I think there's some interesting things. Obviously, one could be, they probably got paid a lot of money for it. You won't find many of those details online. I searched all over to figure out how much of these guys get paid. The only thing I could find is that Fred Seats got about $600,000 from the tobacco industry, which would be about $2 million now. But most of that information isn't out there. I think an interesting thing is this was all done in the late stages of their career. Some were already retired. So they were kind of going into that twilight of their career where they, for years and years, they were the center of attention. They had a lot of power, they had a lot of prestige. Well, this was a way of staying in the limelight. But I think another important point, and Oreskes in their book, they talk about this, is that these were all very ardent anti-communists. They had worked in the defense industry, they had worked in supporting conservative causes, and as far as they were concerned, anything that would start regulations by the government was a slide into communism. And so there was a bit of this kind of Socratic noble lie that I'm actually doing what's right for society because I'm preventing them from sliding into communism. And so I think they could rationalize the work they were doing along those lines. I'd say, fortunately, science won. Eventually, the word got out that smoking does cause lung cancer, and there was a drop in smoking activity starting in the 80s, and by the 1990s, we started to see a leveling off and improvement in lung cancer deaths. In the 1990s, there was new regulation imposed on acid rain, and the amount of wet sulfate, wet nitrate deposition has dropped dramatically over the last 30 years. The Montreal Protocol reduced the number of fluorocarbons that were putting fluoride up into the stratosphere and leading to the ozone hole. Well, that started to stabilize, and models are that that's improving as well. I talked a little bit about the politics of the anti-science movement, and I would say that's a relatively recent change in the anti-science movement. Matthew Mata is a public health researcher. He's interested in looking at how people's opinions about social issues and politics impact their view of science. And in his 2024 book, The Anti-Scientific Americans, he goes back and he looks at about 50 years worth of publicly available polling data. And he's looking for correlations and association and trends that may explain how do we get to this point where we're so polarized. I think one thing that's interesting is, similar to Hofstadter, he found that there is this baseline level of anti-science that's kind of persistent in our culture. In his study, he found that 1 in 3 Americans typically will hold anti-scientific views. But that prior to 2010, it was similar across political parties. But since 2010, that perspective has shifted more towards conservative political views. Now, he attributes this to the rise of the Tea Party. I think one thing as I was reading this is I think he underplays the role of the attention economy there. 2010 was when social media took off. It's when search engines started using algorithms. As we talked about last year, that's a big inflection point there. And I think that really helped to kind of set this kind of on fire. And I think there's other data and researchers out there that suggest the politicalization of science occurred earlier, in the 90s and 2000s. Some of the topics that were discussed in the Merchants of Doubt, those had political overtones with them as well. Now, there was this pre-existing anti-science movement. COVID-19 pandemic really threw gas on the fire. I think it's important to remember that as a country, we hadn't been through a pandemic. In fact, the world hadn't been through a pandemic in almost like 100 years. And we weren't emotionally prepared for it. This idea that we have to have mandates to be able to kind of protect ourselves from viral transmission, wearing masks, social distancing, closing schools, shutting down transportation. That's something we had never experienced before. And I think at the political climate at the time, this invoked a lot of resistance and a lot of anger. People were saying, you're taking away my personal freedoms to be able to kind of manage this pandemic. And given the level of distrust that was already out there, this just kind of exploded. I think you can look at the COVID-19 pandemic, though, and see the consequences of some of that politicization. If you look at COVID-19 mortality, you can kind of think of it as two phases. Now, in May 2021, that's when we had a vaccine that was then universally available. So after May 2021, if you wanted a vaccine, you could go out and get it. This is the area on the right in gray. Prior to that, we didn't have a vaccine. We had to rely on other ways of controlling the spread, wearing masks and social distancing. Now, this line in red are counties in the United States in which 60% of the electorate voted for Donald Trump, so heavily Trump-weighted district. The area in blue are counties in which 60% of the electorate voted for Joe Biden, and the dashed line here is the average for the Americans. Now, early on in the pandemic, those counties that voted for Joe Biden got hit pretty hard with mortality. And you kind of expect that. That was in high urban areas where there's greater population density. If you remember, New York, Seattle, LA, they got hit particularly hard early on because that's typically where the virus enters into the country. But after the vaccine became available, there was a shift. You started to see much more mortality in those counties that voted for Donald Trump, particularly the Delta and the Omicron variant, which hit Texas and Florida particularly hard. Now, there could be a lot of reasons for this. There's a lot of confounding variables, socioeconomic reasons. It could be that Trump voters are a lot older. They're more likely to die when they get COVID. But as they analyzed it, what they found was that the best predictor of looking at vaccine status was one's political affiliation. That there definitely was a political overtone that was driving this. And that vaccine hesitation has really persisted. This is a plot of vaccination rates for diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis in the MMR vaccine from just before the COVID pandemic, which you see it's continued post-pandemic. There's this resistance for vaccination. And as a result, we're starting to see infectious diseases coming back that we haven't seen before. This is US measles cases since the start of the pandemic. Now, early on in the pandemic, we didn't see much measles, partly because all those precautions that we had to prevent transmission of COVID also prevented transmission of measles. But in 2025, it's exploded, where we've had almost 2,000 cases of measles, vast majority in populations in which they're not vaccinated. Now, in 2020, we had no measles cases. We thought we were on the doorstep of eliminating measles. In 2025, we've now had almost 12 months of continuous transmission of measles. Now, for a lot of healthy children, measles is a week of cold and a really bad rash. Most of us that were in training when I came through hadn't seen measles, so I had to go up and look online what it looks like. But the other thing that you get from measles, it's not always an innocuous disease. People that are immune compromised, women that are pregnant, or children less than 5 years of age are at significant risk. You can get a viral pneumonia from it. It can be severe. You can get encephalitis, which is a swelling of the brain, or you get blindness, deafness that can come from it. The hospitalization rate for children under 5 is typically about 20% will need hospitalization, so you're using additional resources. And there's a mortality, typically between 1 to 3 deaths per 1,000 cases. In 2025, there were 3 deaths, 2 of which were in children. So how do we address this need for balance of the public good on one side, and personal autonomy on the other? And we could have vaccine mandates and say, no, for the public good, everybody needs to have a vaccine. The trade-off there is people give up freedom. It's top down, and there's going to be a lot of resistance from it. People lose their personal autonomy. They say, no, this is my body. I ought to have some say in how I get treated. Likewise, if we leave it to personal autonomy, we have to say, there are certain types of diseases in which, from a community standpoint, we have to have compliance or the whole entire society is at risk. So there's a lot of factors that play into it. One thing that we can look at is how infectious the disease is, because that's going to indicate, kind of the risk that you're taking from yourself and putting onto the community. One way to look at that is through basic reproduction number, or R0. And what that basically says is, if you have a common cold, one cause of common cold is a rhinovirus, you may infect 2 to 3 other people. But if you have measles, you're likely to infect 12 to 18 other people. If somebody had measles and was in here, an hour before we walked into the room and left, and you walked into this room and you weren't vaccinated or didn't have immunity, good chance you're going to get measles. It's that contagious, far more contagious than the other things that we deal with. Now, one thing that the infectious rate does is it deals with this concept of herd immunity. That is, how many people need to have immunity to prevent that virus from spreading. Now, in a case like measles that's so infectious, you need about 95% of the population to have immunity to keep it from spreading. Now, there's people in the population that can't get a vaccine. They may be immune compromised, they may have allergies, they may have other health reasons that prevent them from getting vaccines. So when you get your measles vaccine, it's not just to protect you, it's to protect the rest of the community. And given how infectious it is, there's a significant risk to the rest of the community. Now, we wouldn't develop a vaccine for the common cold. One is that there's hundreds of different viruses that cause common cold symptoms. It's relatively self-contained, and it's not very infectious. So how about the childhood vaccines that were recently removed from the CDC universal recommendations? What's the rationalization behind that? Well, fortunately, the CDC wasn't very transparent in that, but I would say the chair of the APIC said, when we look at vaccines now, we're putting a heavy emphasis on personal freedom. So if you think of that balance, it's weighted heavily towards the personal freedom side. I think one way to kind of look at rationalizing that is look at this concept of herd immunity for those viruses. And the problem is, for these viruses, it's a little nebulous if we can even obtain herd immunity. So for example, influenza, COVID, and RSV, these are viruses that frequently mutate. The way we develop a vaccine is you have models say, what are the 3 most likely variants that are going to hit our population? Let's make vaccines for those. But that virus is constantly shifting. So the idea that we're going to get herd immunity to prevent the spread, just doesn't happen with these viruses. With rotavirus, it's hard to get sustained immunization to that. This is a virus, particularly in young infants, can cause severe diarrhea and can lead to hospitalizations for dehydration. And then for diseases like hepatitis and meningococcal disease, the transmission there is a lot more dependent on individualized risk factors. For example, hepatitis B is transmitted through contact with body fluids. So if you're a doctor or a nurse and you're prone to needle sticks, you may want to get the hepatitis B vaccine because you're at significant risk of coming into contact with it, which may not be true for the general public. So I think, kind of looking at that, the recommendation was, let's shift it to personal choice, because from a community standpoint, it doesn't have the same benefit for maybe some of those other vaccines. But I would say the one thing that we have to realize is that we've had a long history of working with vaccines on these viruses. They have an excellent safety profile. They've had very good efficacy. I can think of, you look at the influenza pandemic, or almost a pandemic now that we're seeing a huge rise in influenza, particularly in some of the pediatric populations, from those people that aren't immunized. The problem with hepatitis B, talking about not having that as a mandatory vaccine. Well, we actually tried only vaccinating people whose mothers tested positive for hepatitis B, because that would make the child at risk. But what we found is that there was still a fairly large number of kids that came down with chronic hepatitis B infection. Now, that's a chronic disease with no cure. It's likely to lead to liver failure and liver cancers and require liver transplants in the future. It's a devastating disease. So you have a vaccine that's got good efficacy, good safety, and when that went into place, we really didn't see that anymore. It's one they used in China where they had a real problem. They've seen a significant drop in the chronic hepatitis B vaccination. So the recommendation here is to have that discussion with your physician, which frankly you should do for any vaccine that you're getting. You ought to feel comfortable taking it, and you ought to understand what you're putting into your body. So what are the consequences of an anti-science movement? I think one of the ones that probably concerns me the most is the loss of public trust. If you look at COVID-19 outcomes, the countries that did best were countries that had a high level of public trust in their public health infrastructure. They trusted the people that were putting out the information, they acted appropriately to it, and they worked cooperatively. If we lose that public trust, it's really tough to get back. And we're always going to have this kind of tension and animosity towards each other. We've seen a significant weakening of the public health infrastructure. The CDC is no longer at the same level of capacity to be able to pick up early pandemics that are starting, or to be able to provide us with accurate information and data on how these diseases are propagating. There's been other significant loss of important health infrastructure that we've had. With the decreasing vaccination, as I mentioned, we're seeing reemergence of infectious diseases, ones that we haven't seen in years. I mean, there's talk now of removing the polio vaccine. Part of it is we haven't seen polio in the U.S. for a while. I would say that polio virus is here. There was actually somebody who had polio in New York. There was an active case. And in viral samplings in wastewater, there's polio virus out there. So you start to get more and more people now that don't have a polio immunity to polio. You're going to start to see a reemergence of that as well. They talk about a devastating disease. Just show a few pictures of the iron lung clinics back then, and the number of people that were paralyzed by this. A disease where you have a very safe vaccine, but because of fear and misinformation, we're not having it. Go back, I said, I think people ought to always have that ability to have choice about vaccines, but they need to have the right information to be able to make those choices, and that's not the case. I think another thing I'm really worried about is the loss of investment in research we've seen. I mean, it has had a devastating impact on our ability not only to do science in the present, but more importantly, to train the scientists we need in the future. And so the effect of this is going to not only be seen in the near future, it's going to be seen for decades. And I think we don't appreciate how important that investment was in driving our economy. Most of the advances we've seen in our economy have been driven by our ability to innovate. We've been the best innovators in the world. We cut our research, we lose that innovation. And finally, I think we're seeing a proliferation of scientific illiteracy. As more and more people are exposed to misinformation and they lose that ability to really understand what's true information and what's false information, it becomes difficult to really address the anti-science movement. So some final thoughts after that uplifting talk. I'll go back to the question, how did we get here? And I would argue we've always been here. We've always had a strong anti-intellectual, anti-science movement in the United States. I think what's concerning now is that it's been weaponized in ways by people who know how to use it in order to drive specific economic and political goals. And now with the attention economy, they have a lot of tools at their disposal to really kind of force that issue. That's a significant problem. I think the focus that we've had simply on addressing misinformation that's out there is ineffective. This is a war of attrition. You're playing whack-a-mole. And studies that are out there looking at how you address misinformation have showed that that's not particularly effective. Fortunately, NSF just canceled 20 grants that were looking at disinformation. So, God forbid we learn more about disinformation where it's becoming an epidemic. The other big thing I think is, what do we do about this loss of social trust? And I think that's an important area to work on. I think one, science has to learn how to better communicate with the general public. What we do is important. What we do is incredibly complicated. And it's not enough to talk to each other. We need to be able to talk to the public in ways that they can understand, the ways that address their fears, their concerns. If we're not talking to them, somebody else who may not have the best intentions is going to be talking to them. And last, I said, what does this anti-science mean to us as a people? We lost that ability to look at this world with awe and wonder, to be able to ask those big, bold questions that are necessary to solve these problems that we have now. can we humble ourselves to recognize that science is going to tell us how the world is, not how we want it to be? You know, that there's a lot about this world that we don't understand. So, questions and comments, thank you. Claudia.
What do other industrialized countries think? I mean, do they have the same problems?
Yeah, probably not to the extent that we have. You know, I think one of the things that we've seen, you know, are wide swings back and forth. But, you know, I think there is a level of populism, and, you know, the themes that I talk about in the United States, there's reasons why they're common here, but they're not unique. And so I think you are seeing it. I think one of the things that's happening, other countries are looking at us and saying, oh man, by the grace of God go I. You know, and they're also looking at it as a great buying opportunity. You're seeing a lot of offers for top-notch scientists to go start labs in other countries. You know, there's been 30%, this is out of a Nature study that just came out like 2 days ago, in the most recent journal. You know, 30% applications for scientists to start labs in other countries. So, you know, big ones like Canada and stuff. You know, if you were a country and you wanted to bolster your science infrastructure, you know, it's a shopping spree now, you know, especially going to mRNA technology and things like that, you know, who's willing to make those investments? Us.
Well, that's true with our grandson. He was applying for scientific research. He applied for 14 places, all but one said, we have to reject you, you're a great candidate, we have no money.
Yep.
No, wait, he did get one. He went to the research, and out of the 30 people who are studying there, over half of them have been contacted by foreign countries. We'll pay your tuition, you're great, come and work for us. There you go.
Absolutely.
Because my own son is, our grandson is experiencing.
And I think the other thing we don't appreciate, you know, for those of us that ran labs, is how important the international talent was. I mean, one of our big strengths, where we got the best and brightest in the world to come work in U.S. labs.
Not anymore.
You know, and now it's going the other direction. You know, with the problems with immigration and with the cuts in science and the loss of funding, those people are going other places. And, you know, our science relied heavily on people from other countries. I mean, if you look at Nobel Prize winners in the U.S. is way out in front with gold medals in Nobel Prize. But about a third of that was for people that immigrated to the United States. You know, and so we lose that spot. This is not the destination point now. You know, we're sellers now, not buyers. Bill?
I can't help but comment, living through COVID and living through polio in the early 60s, early 50s. When the polio vaccine came out, people lined up by the hundreds, thousands even, and there was no hesitation. And it was an experimental vaccine.
Right.
I can remember, we lived in Annapolis at the time, and they would come out and they would literally run out of vaccine. There were that many people coming in just to get it for not only themselves, but them and their kids.
And I think, you know, one of the things there is they lived through it.
Yeah,
they knew what polio meant and what
Yes.
the risk was. I mean, just to kind of on top of that, you know, when the polio vaccine first came out, it's an attenuated virus. So basically you would heat up the virus, make it less virulent, and that would be injected. Well, about 2 months into the polio vaccine, there was an incident at Cutter Labs in California where they forgot to heat up the virus. You know, and 40,000 people got injected with live polio virus. You know, and there was a significant number of people that got polio, you know, that were paralyzed and even died from it. Yet people came back the next year and continued to get polio vaccines. Could you imagine if that happened now? We wouldn't see that. That would be the end of it.
The one comment you didn't mention that I think is a cause of a lot of this mis and disinformation, social media.
Yeah, it is.
Social media, people that live by social media should die by it because it's
Well,
just.
sometimes they are.
Yeah, well, they are, right.
Yeah, I purposely didn't talk about it because I spent a lot of time last year talking
I know.
about it. I kind of say, like,
But
put it in the
it's-
link, go back and look at that
But
topic.
it's still there.
Yeah, it is. I think the thing that's a little problematic is I think we put a lot of the blame on social media, but we shouldn't underplay the role that regular media is. We
Yeah.
have a pretty illiterate media out there when it comes to knowing how to communicate science. Even those with good intentions. You know, they're not trained in science, they don't know how to understand it well. they often will take, those of us that have had to talk to the media about our science, they'll take some tiny little talking point, they'll blow it out, watch it on the news, like, oh my God, please, I can't believe they said that. So we need a better, well-trained source of communicating information to them.
My son has made a decent living turning doctor speak into English.
We need that,
And
that's
he's still
especially what we
doing it.
need.
And I mean, it's that very thing, he said, it's just,
It's very important. I mean, I think the only way, if we're not talking to each other, how can we have trust to each other? So I think we need to do more of
but do other people remember the measles parties?
that. Chicken pox.
And
yes,
chicken pox.
yes.
Yeah.
I think that's part of the problem too, is people say, well, I lived through it.
I saw that body, I had that body that you had a photograph up there.
Yeah, and I think, we remember it because for most healthy people, that's the outcome. It's a relatively well-controlled disease. You go through it and you're immune. But there are some people that's not the case. There's a fair number that get hospitalized and die from it. Mumps used to be a major cause of deafness. So there's these diseases that we kind of look back and say, oh, they weren't that bad. No, they weren't that bad.
It's all relative.
I mean, it seems like there's, like you're saying, growing kind of anti-science. Do you think with as vaccines maybe trail back, we start to see more and more measles and people get more exposed to it, maybe we start to see polio again, which is this all very awful scenario.
Yeah.
But do you think that will shift the
One would
paradigm?
think.
I would think, I don't know.
One would think that's the case. I'm not entirely convinced. Partly because, I've seen already with the rise in measles, kind of how they spin this.
Yeah.
It's like, oh no, this is good. This means you're getting natural immunity and all this. This is how you're going to be healthier in the long run, rather than get that vaccine, which is going to cause all these other chronic diseases that nobody's telling you about. So, I think the message has to go along with that. And what has to recognize is, you can have personal choice, but you also have accountability for that choice. You don't want to get your child hepatitis B. Well, if they come down with chronic hepatitis B, that's on you.
Give us your recipe of hope. After all that.
I think the hopefulness I see would be, again, that this is not new. We've gone through these cycles before and for throughout time. And I think eventually, we'll start to see it move back the other way, that there will be kind of a recognition that, ability to rationalize things and work through problems is important. And I think we're in a hyper-emotional state as a country, as a world. I think the social media aspects are important in driving that. We're, in a country that wants immediate answers. And I think eventually people are going to say, I'm fatigued from this. This is not working. And are gonna, we're starting to see these diseases coming back, and we're seeing a weakening of, resources that we didn't realize we were so reliant on. And eventually it'll start to heal itself. But it's a matter of how far are we from kind of that healing. You got to stabilize first, and then hopefully start to heal. But I think it's going to be a long haul. All right.
1 minute.
Got 1 minute left online, but if there's other questions. And just to remind people who came in late, take out your phone and mark the calendar for March 21st for the crossing. That will be my uplifting moment. You'll have the opportunity to see a world-class choral group. They've won 4 Grammys, just amazing musicians that will completely change your perspective of choral music there. So it'll be a wonderful, wonderful evening. So put that on your calendar. We all need a little bit of
What's
hope.
that date again?
March 21st, 5 p.m. If you want to come out earlier, we're going to be having a conversation at 4 o'clock with the conductor, Donald Nally, talking about the background of the crossing and the commission pieces that they'll be performing.
You have to buy a ticket.
Yes.
Yeah, they're online, yep, they're on.
All right, well, thank you.
Thank you, Dennis.